They came at dusk, two towering Apache women, bloodied, breathless, and on the run. Amos Cutter, a poor rancher barely scraping by, chose kindness over fear, and opened his door. By dawn, the prairie was rumbling. 100 horses rode in. At their front, the Apache chief, face carved in sorrow and steel. What he brought wasn't vengeance. It was a decision that would tear the land and Amos's soul in two. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The horses came like thunder rolling over the hills, dust kicking up in sheets, hooves striking the earth like war drums. Amos Cutter stood barefoot on his warped porch boards, the splintered wood creaking under his weight, sweat already trickling down his back though the morning was still cool. He counted at least 20 Apache riders as they encircled his meager ranch, their silhouettes sharp against the sun, rifles slung loose, faces painted like ghosts of vengeance. A few of the men broke formation and scanned the land, checking the barn, the well, the chicken coop, methodical, disciplined. The tension hung thick, caught somewhere between the creak of leather saddles and the soft whimpering of Amos's mule tied near the corral. He raised his hands slowly, fingers trembling, jaw clenched so tight he thought a tooth might snap. He'd made peace with dying before many times, in quiet ways but never with so many eyes on him, and never for a sin as simple as kindness. The frontmost rider dismounted. He was older than the rest, not by age but by the way the world clung to him, lines carved into his face like riverbeds through canyon stone, eyes dark with memory. His feet touched the dust like they belonged to it. Amos could barely meet his gaze. The man stepped forward, slowly, hand resting not on his weapon but on a bundle of cloth tucked beneath his arm. Amos opened his mouth to speak, to explain why he helped the sisters, to beg that no blood be spilled here, but he never got the chance. The Apache chief raised one hand, palm open to the sky, and said a single word in English, his accent thick and solemn: gratitude. The word dropped like a stone in still water. Amos blinked, confused, his heart still battering his ribs like a trapped bird. But the other riders did not lower their guard. If anything, the air grew tighter, as though violence had simply been postponed, delayed, not denied. A younger warrior spat near Amos's boot. Another scanned the hills behind him, likely noting every path of retreat. But none moved forward. The chief stepped past Amos without further word, walking toward the open door of the house where the sisters still rested. Leah and Taya had not come out. They hadn't spoken much since arriving, just gestures, weary nods, eyes too old for their years. Amos turned his head slowly, tracking the chief's path, unsure whether this would end in mercy or in ritual. Behind him, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of horses and gun oil and the faintest trace of crushed sage. Amos remained where he was, hands still raised, his lungs aching. He was not safe, not forgiven, but something else had begun here, something sacred, or dangerous, or both, and he could feel it move beneath his boots like a tremor waiting to split the earth. The moon rose like a pale wound above the flat sweep of land, casting long, silver shadows over the brittle grass and crumbling fence posts, and Amos Cutter sat by the fire, his calloused hands turning a blackened coffee tin in the embers, more for something to do than for warmth. Just beyond the flicker of the flames, clustered in a loose half-circle near the cottonwoods, the Apache camp had taken form. Low fires, murmured voices, silhouettes shifting like smoke among the tents. The warriors had said little after surrounding his land that morning, but their presence was a constant hum beneath the skin, like a warning that had teeth. Leah and Taya, the sisters he had found near dead just days ago, sat close beside him now, wrapped in rough blankets he had pulled from his father's old trunk, their long black hair undone and tangled from the ordeal, their faces lit in shards of firelight that made them look both young and ancient. Taya's arm was still stiff, bound with a splint Amos had fashioned from fence, slats, and twine. Leah bore deep scratches across her back, remnants of thorn and lash and struggle, but neither had cried out once, even when he'd cleaned the wounds with boiled whiskey. They spoke in low voices to each other sometimes, but never to him, not out of rudeness, he felt, but from a silence carved by things beyond language. Leah's eyes were heavy, but not dulled, sharp and watching. Always watching, and Taya's still flinched at every distant hoofbeat, as though the memory of chase had made her muscles forget peace. Amos didn't speak either, unsure what could be said to women who had escaped such ruin, or to warriors who could arrive like ghosts and speak of gratitude with rifles strapped to their backs. He kept his eyes on the fire and tried not to think of the neighbors who'd already whispered that he was too close to the Apache, too strange since his wife died, too willing to cross lines that others still guarded with fear and bullets. In the distance, from the heart of the Apache camp, a drum began to beat low, steady, rising like the blood pulse before battle. It wasn't loud, but it filled the space between breaths, stirring the coals, curling the smoke toward the stars. Amos looked toward it, then back at the sisters. Leah's gaze met his across the fire, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she nodded not in thanks, not in kinship, but in recognition. You helped us. You are marked now. The drumbeats deepened, joined by voices he couldn't understand, the kind that rose not for song, but remembrance. Amos stared into the flames and thought of his father's Bible, long since buried under floorboards. He wondered what kind of God he had invoked by opening his door to the hunted. He wondered what mercy was really worth out here, under this sky. And he wondered if the cost was already sealed. It began 3 nights earlier, beneath a sky so starless it looked burned black, when Leah and Taya were yanked from their sleep by rough hands and dragged like animals from a ravine where they'd hidden from the sun daughters of the Apache, warriors' blood in their veins, reduced in an instant to quarry. The men who took them were bounty hunters, not soldiers or settlers, but worse in some ways half-drunk with greed and old stories of Apache gold hidden in sacred mountains, men who believed that somewhere in the sisters' quiet eyes or inked skin was a map to treasure that had cursed the white man's dreams for generations. They spoke in snarls, English twisted by tobacco and ignorance, calling them witches, savages, and worse, laughing as they tied their wrists with wire and hauled them over mule saddles like bags of feed. Leah had fought first, landing a headbutt that bloodied one man's nose, but the butt of a rifle silenced her resistance. Taya had only screamed once sharp, defiant before her mouth was gagged and her legs bound. They rode for miles through thorn brush and silence, until the men made camp in a dry wash, lit no fire, and argued over who would get first watch and who'd get first crack at interrogating. That night, as coyotes howled and the men drank whiskey from cracked canteens, the sisters lay side by side in the dirt, whispering in the old tongue not of escape, but of each other. Taya pressed her forehead to Leah's and mouthed a single word, "Together." And Leah, bruised and bleeding, mouthed it back. When the time came when one of the men dozed and the other wandered to relieve himself, the sisters moved like shadows. Taya twisted her wrists until the wire bit deep, dislocating her thumb to slip free. Leah rolled onto her knees, her binding still tight, and waited. The man who returned never had a chance. Taya struck first rock to temple, then took his knife and cut her sister loose. They didn't speak. They didn't wait. They ran, barefoot, through cactus and snake grass, over jagged rock and dry gulch. The desert tore their feet, the wind cut their eyes, the darkness held claws, but they ran. At one point, Leah collapsed, sobbing into the dust, but Taya hauled her up with a strength born of fury and love. Behind them, a single shot echoed a hunter's blind shot into night. They didn't look back. For 2 days they ran, surviving on muddy water and cactus pulp, guiding themselves by the sliver of moon and the wind. By the time they stumbled across Amos Cutter's land, sunburned, blood-crusted, and near dead, their hands were still interlocked, fingers wrapped like roots in shared pain. Their bond had saved them. Their silence had preserved them. But some things inside them had cracked wide open in that desert, the kind of wounds no firelight or kindness could mend. And though they no longer bled, the ache was far from over. The dawn broke slow and heavy, as if even the sky was burdened by what was coming, bleeding pink across the hills while Amos Cutter stood beside his sagging barn, hands tucked into the pockets of a coat too thin for the chill, watching the Apache chief approach through the morning mist. The old man moved with the stillness of stone, 2 warriors flanking him, their eyes unreadable beneath painted brows. They stopped just short of Amos's porch, where the sisters still slept fitfully inside, wrapped in his threadbare sheets and the smell of pine tar and whiskey-soaked bandages. The chief didn't speak right away. He simply looked at Amos deep and long, as if weighing the man's marrow, and then, with a voice flat as hammered iron, made the offer. "Stay with us. Be protected. Be named brother." or walk away, and speak none of this again. It was not a threat. It was a line drawn clean in the dust. Amos said nothing, his eyes flickering to the horizon where smoke rose faint from a distant homestead, one of his neighbors. Maybe, watching already, maybe talking. They'd seen the horses. They'd seen the riders. Word would be spreading. He's gone red, they'd say. Gone soft. In town, the old Civil War flag still flew crooked above the jailhouse, and the church windows were still etched with stained glass saints holding rifles. Amos had no illusions about the mercy of the people he used to pray beside. He thought of his crops, withered rows of corn stunted by drought, the fence line broken where cattle once leaned but no longer came. He thought of his wife's grave, overgrown behind the house, and the day he'd buried her with only wind for witness. He thought of Leah's eyes, wide with fever, and Taya's hand clutching his wrist in her sleep like she'd never been held safe before. The chief waited. Not impatient. Just eternal. Amos licked his lips, dry as parchment, and looked down at his boots, dust-caked, cracked, soles almost split. He wanted to speak. He wanted to say he needed time, but time was not a currency he had anymore. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of horse sweat and firewood and something older earth that had bled. He saw again the men who'd burned his father's barn for harboring a Cherokee woman in '62. He saw again the look in the sheriff's eye when he'd asked why Amos didn't carry a rifle anymore. Loyalty to country, loyalty to God, loyalty to land. Words, all of them, until you had to choose between feeding the hungry and locking the door. The sisters stirred behind the window, silhouettes shifting against the thin curtain. Amos stared at the chief, throat tight. But no answer came. Not yet. Only silence, heavy and human and trembling with the weight of a decision that could not be taken back. The chief nodded once, turned, and walked away, leaving Amos standing alone, wrapped in the last quiet before the choice would burn everything down. The sun was high and mean when Sheriff Miles rode in, his long shadow stretching across the dry ground like a warning nailed to the earth. The dust from his horse's hooves lingering in the air as if even the dirt didn't trust him to stay gone. He didn't dismount at first, just sat tall in the saddle, legs stiff, fingers drumming on the butt of the worn Colt strapped to his thigh. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of a sweat-stained hat that had seen the insides of too many saloons and the outsides of too many gallows. "Morning, Cutter," he said, voice low and graveled like it had been dragged through broken glass. And Amos, standing near the barn with a pitchfork he hadn't touched in hours, nodded once and said nothing. Miles wasn't a man who needed much invitation. He swung down, boots hitting the ground hard, and walked straight past Amos without waiting to be offered coffee or courtesy. He crouched by the fence, ran his fingers through the dust, then followed the faint line of hoofprints leading west Apache tracks, close set, disciplined. He looked toward the hills, where smoke still curled lazily into the blue sky, a thin column betraying a camp that shouldn't be there. Then his eyes drifted to the barn door half open, and to the splintered slats where wire bindings had been cut, the blood still faintly visible in the dirt. He didn't speak for a long time, just let the silence stretch like a noose between them, then turned, slow and sure, and looked Amos dead in the eye. "You hid them, didn't you, Cutter?" The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They landed heavy, thick with the kind of certainty that didn't wait for truth to catch up. Amos stared back, throat dry, stomach twisting in a slow grind. "Don't know what you're talking about," he said flatly, forcing the lie through cracked lips, the words tasting like rust. Miles tilted his head, studying him, not angry, not yet, but calculating, like a man measuring rope. "You were a preacher once," he said quietly, as if that was an accusation in itself. "Preacher ought to know better than to take in blood trouble." Amos didn't answer, didn't move. The sisters were silent inside, hidden beneath floorboards now, breath shallow, bodies still too weak to run again. Miles spat into the dirt, then turned and walked back to his horse, but the way his boots moved said it wasn't over. "Watch yourself," he muttered, more to the wind than to Amos, then mounted and rode off at a slow, deliberate pace. He didn't head toward town, just circled the rise, then disappeared behind a line of scrub and rock, where a man could watch a homestead from a rifle's length away. Amos stood there long after the hoofbeats faded, heart pounding, knowing the storm was closer now, not in the hills, not in the Apache camp, but right behind him, wearing a badge and a memory long enough to kill with. They came again at twilight, the kind of hour where the sky bleeds gold and the land forgets which shadows belong to what. And Amos stood waiting near the oak tree where he used to hang lanterns for his wife to find her way home from the field. Only now, the ones approaching didn't need light to find him. The Apache chief rode at the center of a quiet procession, flanked not by warriors this time, but by 3 elders, each marked with the deep etchings of years and ceremony, their faces painted in the bone-white patterns of counsel and spirit. They dismounted without a word, their eyes resting not on the house or the land, but on Amos himself, as though it wasn't his boots in the dust they saw, but his soul. The chief stepped forward, slower now, older somehow under the setting sun, and when he spoke, his voice held none of the stone it had before, only something heavier. "You gave without asking," he said, the words paced like ritual. "You fed those our enemies hunted. You broke your own law." The wind rustled the brittle grass, and Amos said nothing, his hands at his sides, his throat too tight to speak. One of the elders stepped forward and laid something at his feet, a folded cloth, brown-red with old dye, and within it, a carved totem, eagle wings outstretched, eyes cut deep into the wood. "No white man has been offered this," the chief said, his eyes narrowing not in challenge, but in the solemn burden of what came next. "To us, you are marked now. You saved our daughters. That does not disappear. We offer you blood bond family not by birth, but by fire. You take it, and we take you. But the world you came from." He glanced to the horizon, toward the hills where smoke still curled from settler chimneys. "You will not walk in both worlds. You will be one of us, or none at all." The words sank into the earth like arrows. Behind Amos, he could feel the weight of it, the house, the grave, the memories still nailed to the walls. Inside, Leah and Taya were quiet again, watching through the cracks in the shutters, their presence a reminder of both the danger and the grace that had crossed his path. He looked down at the totem, its feathered wings spread like a judgment passed from sky to man. Part of him wanted to run to say he was just a rancher, not a fighter, not a brother to warriors and spirits, but another part, deeper and stubborn as old roots, knew he had already crossed the line that separates man from moment. The chief didn't speak again. He only waited, as still as the dusk itself, and Amos felt the dust shift beneath his boots, felt the pull of 2 worlds tearing at his ribs. He didn't pick up the totem. Not yet. But he didn't step away either. And that, for now, was answer enough. The night came without stars, a thick blanket of black pressing down on the land like judgment, and Amos Cutter stood alone at the edge of his field, the house behind him dim and silent, the totem still wrapped in its cloth on the porch where he hadn't yet dared touch it again. The wind had stilled, the crickets gone quiet, and all that filled the air now was the distant echo of drums, faint, steady, the pulse of a world that waited for his answer. But the only sound Amos truly heard was the roar inside his own chest. He dropped to his knees without thinking, the dry soil cracking beneath him, and began to claw at the ground with his bare hands, scooping and scraping and bleeding knuckles into the dirt that had betrayed him too many times to count. His crops had failed 3 seasons in a row. Rain had passed him by like an old friend turned cold, and the cattle he once prayed over were bones now, scattered across hills that hadn't known grass in months. He had nothing left but ghosts his wife, Ellie, her laugh still clinging to the corners of the bedroom like dust he couldn't sweep away, her final breath echoing in that long, still moment between prayers. She would have told him to help the sisters. She'd always believed in the kind of mercy that cost something, but she'd also been buried beneath a cross carved by his own hand, on land the law still said was his, and Amos couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he chose now might turn her memory to ash. He dug deeper, fingers slicing on stone, and wept without sound as the tears mingled with dirt, as if the land might recognize grief better than hope. He remembered the way Leah had flinched when he touched her shoulder with the gentleness of a man unused to being needed. He remembered Taya's eyes, dry and distant, except for that one moment at the fire when her lip had trembled and she'd looked at him like she wasn't sure he was real. The world saw them as threats. Amos had seen them as people broken, hunted, but alive. And somehow that made him the enemy now. He could already feel the whispers growing louder in the nearby town. Cutter's gone soft. Cutter's gone red. Cutter's a traitor. He had once worn a Union coat. Now they'd call him worse than Confederate. They'd call him something not even human. And still he planted. One seed, then another. With no rain in sight, with no promise that anything would grow. He just kept digging, burying those fragile husks like prayers whispered to a God who'd long since stopped answering. He didn't believe in miracles, but he believed in trying. And as he knelt there, hands bloodied and caked with earth, he understood what the chief's offer really meant. It wasn't adoption. It was surrender. Surrender to truth, to sacrifice, to starting again in a land that punished mercy but demanded it anyway. When the first light cracked across the plains, Amos smelled the smoke before he saw it, bitter, acrid, wrong, and his boots hit the porch boards hard as he crossed the yard in long strides, heart pounding like hooves in his chest. The western fence, what was left of it, stood charred and skeletal against the rising sun, blackened posts still smoldering, curls of ash dancing in the breeze like tiny ghosts. The fire had been deliberate, precise. Only the west fence, the one nearest the trail that led to the Apache camp, the one that faced away from town. No livestock had wandered, no structures touched. It wasn't a robbery. It was a warning, a message. Choose a side. The words weren't carved or spoken, but they hung in the air as thick as the smoke, as if branded into the sky itself. Amos stared at the wreckage, jaw clenched, fists balled at his sides. Behind him, the soft shuffle of feet, Leah and Taya, silent and alert, weapons in hand, eyes hard now, stripped of exhaustion, made sharp by truth. They didn't speak either. They didn't need to. They knew what the fire meant. So did Amos. This wasn't about stolen cattle or trespass anymore. This was about fear, settler fear, white fear, the kind that didn't sleep when its borders were blurred, the kind that lit fires in the dark and dared men like Amos to cross a line drawn in blood and ash. He glanced toward the house, toward the shovel leaning against the porch, the rifle hanging on rusted nails by the door. His fingers twitched, a muscle memory begging him to grip wood and steel, to prepare for a defense he knew would come like floodwater fast, merciless, swallowing everything in its path. But instead, Amos exhaled, slow, steady, like letting go of something he couldn't carry anymore, and turned toward the open prairie. The grass was high, wild, stretching out toward the hills where the Apache fire still burned low and steady like a heartbeat. He didn't look back. Didn't ask if the sisters would follow. They did. Of course they did. Their footsteps moved with his in rhythm, 3 shadows cutting across a world that didn't want them. Every step Amos took was a surrender not to defeat, but to clarity, to a choice already made in the quiet spaces of sleepless nights and dirt-stained prayers. He could not be both things, settler and sanctuary. They had made sure of that. The rifle stayed on the wall. The house stayed behind. The smoke drifted upward like a signal, and the prairie opened before him like a truth too wide to ignore. Let them come, he thought. Let the ones who lit the fire see exactly where he stood. No walls, no weapons. Just a man walking into the arms of a people the world called enemy, and finding there not safety, but purpose. He walked without hesitation, and the earth did not shake, but something deeper did. Something final. Something free. The sky burned orange as evening crept across the hills, the wind whispering through the cottonwoods like voices too old for language, and Amos Cutter stood barefoot in a ring of stones, the smoke of cedar and sage rising around him in solemn spirals. The Apache gathered in a half-circle, faces painted with ash and ochre, their silence deeper than any sermon Amos had ever preached. Leah and Taya stood nearest him, no longer cloaked in frailty, but in firelight and pride, their eyes locked on his as the old songs began low, rhythmic, woven with drums and chants that didn't reach his ears so much as his bones. He didn't understand the words, not fully, not the syllables that rolled from the elder's tongue, or the prayers braided into smoke, but he felt them settle into his skin, like roots taking hold in earth long hardened by drought. The chief stepped forward, holding a carved feather in his palm, an eagle's plume, etched with markings Amos couldn't read but felt branded across time, and he spoke in Apache first, voice reverent and slow, before shifting to English with effort. "You are no longer outside," he said. "You are blood now. We do not call you Amos Cutter." That man stayed behind. The chief looked to Leah, who stepped closer, her expression unreadable until she placed her hand gently on Amos's chest, just above the heart that had broken and healed more times than he could name. Siltsil, she whispered. Stands between. It was not a name of conquest, not one of might or legend, but of balance, of a man who had chosen to live in the divide between worlds, neither fully one nor the other, but tethered to both by the quiet act of mercy. Taya repeated it, her voice softer, like wind through pine. Tsutsil. And Amos felt the sound settle into him like breath after drowning. The chief extended the feather. Amos reached for it, but his hand trembled as it rose, not from fear, but from mourning for the man he had been, the preacher who had buried a wife in dust, the rancher who had failed his land, the settler who'd tried so long to be good by rules written in someone else's blood. The feather touched his fingers, light but heavy, and as he took it, the circle around him exhaled, not in applause, not in celebration, but in recognition. A new man had stood up from the ashes of an old life, still scarred, still uncertain, but chosen. Leah leaned in and said the word again, softer this time, almost like a secret. Brother. And for the first time in what felt like years, Amos let himself believe that perhaps he was no longer alone in this world, not forgiven by the one he'd left behind, but accepted by the one he now called home. The fire cracked, the drums quieted, and the wind carried his new name into the night like a promise. The hills were quiet, but not empty. High above the valley, behind a line of brittle brush and sandstone, 6 men lay on their bellies, rifles braced against rocks, scopes trained on the firelit ceremony unfolding far below. The wind shifted gently, rustling sage and dry grass, carrying the scent of cedar smoke and sweat from the Apache camp like a memory born on the land itself. Sheriff Miles crouched apart from the others, his eyes locked through the glass scope on a single figure standing at the heart of the circle. Amos Cutter, now wrapped in a patterned shawl, a carved eagle feather clutched in one hand, his face neither painted nor pale, but something entirely in between. Look at him, muttered the youngest of the watchers, his finger twitching against the trigger of a long-barreled Sharps rifle. Fool thinks he's one of them now. Miles didn't answer. He didn't correct him. Didn't say that he'd seen that same look in the eyes of dying men who'd finally told the truth with their last breath. He didn't mention that Amos had once baptized his wife in the river behind the chapel, or that the man who now stood so still among the enemy had once wept alone at her grave in a storm no one else braved. Miles just lowered the scope slowly, resting the rifle's barrel on his thigh, his jaw tight, his hat pulled low to hide the thoughts flashing behind his eyes. He had come ready to end something, ready to paint justice in the colors the town would understand, but now, watching Amos stand taller than he ever had, surrounded by people who'd buried more than they'd ever taken, something in Miles refused to pull the trigger. Down in the valley, the firelight danced across the feather in Amos's hand, casting long shadows that looked like wings stretching across the dirt, and the drums had stilled. But the silence was not empty, it was sacred, final, the kind of quiet that follows a truth spoken aloud. Amos didn't look up toward the hills. Maybe he knew eyes were watching. Maybe he didn't. But he stood there unarmed, unafraid, no longer asking for permission to exist between the lines drawn in blood and memory. He was not Apache by birth, not settler by loyalty. He was something else now, something rare and dangerous to men who only knew how to divide the world into ours and theirs. He stood as the land itself stood, scarred, old, and unwilling to be tamed. In the brush above, one of the men hissed, "We gonna do this or not?" And Miles didn't blink. "Not today," he said. The others exchanged looks, but no one dared move first. The sun slipped lower, and the stars began to bloom. In the valley, Amos turned slightly, just enough for the firelight to catch his face, calm, resolute, whole. And far above, the men in the hills slowly faded into shadow, while the man they once called traitor walked steady into the dawn of a story still being written.